The purity time between two menstrual periods at least 15 days, but there's no maximum for it. What that means is it's possible for a woman to menstruate once in her life and never menstruate again. So there's no maximum or a purity period. All right, so with that being said, you want to pose your question from there?
So my question is, obviously my period has went beyond the 15 days. And so my question is, how long would the istihada last before I can calculate the start of the next period, if that makes sense?
Yes, the question is clear. So now, was it clear for you when I said that the purity period has no limit? That implies that sickness bleeding itself can have no limit.
Let's say the sickness bleeding stopped, and then it stopped for 2 days and it started again. Would that be considered my period? Because you're saying that istihada is purity time.
Yes, istihada is purity time. So remember also that a woman has two cases. Either she can tell the difference between her bleedings, meaning she can physically detect the difference between the bleedings or not. I'll tell you what, actually, if you don't mind, let's pray Maghrib because it just came in, and then let me pray and then I can relax.
So just to recap, my question was, how long does the istihada go for? And if it stops for a day, for example, my bleeding, and starts again, is that my period?
Okay, so what you want to look for is the sign of menstruation. Now, there's two types of women in this case. A woman who can distinguish between her menstrual blood and her sickness blood, and then there's a woman who cannot distinguish between them. There's three characteristics of menstrual blood: color, smell, and thickness. If a woman sees two types of bleeding, a strong bleeding and a weak bleeding, we know that her menses cannot go beyond 15 days. So once she gets into day 16, then she knows that she's not menstruating. All right. Here, the question is, when did the sickness bleeding start? So the way she knows when it started is by one of two things. If she saw two different types of blood, a weak blood and a strong blood, then the strong bleeding, like the black blood, for example, then that's her menses. And the weak bleeding, like the red or the pink blood, her sickness bleeding, right? She knows on day 16, she looks back and she says, the strong bleeding was for 5 days, for example, and then it changed after that, and now I'm in day 16. So now everything from day 6 until now is sickness bleeding. Now, that's for the woman who can tell the difference. If she can't tell the difference, that means all the blood came out with the same smell, the same color, and the same thickness from day 1 until day 16. Now, how can she tell when did the sickness bleeding start? She tells when the sickness bleeding started by resorting back to her norm. So if she was a woman who would usually menstruate for, let's say, 5 days, then she says, okay, all this blood came out the same way, and now I'm on day 16. I know that I'm not menstruating, and it all came out the same way. And the rule is, when it all comes out the same way, I resort back to my personal norm. My personal norm is to menstruate for 5 days, for example. On day 6, the sickness bleeding started, and now I'm on day 16. So that's when it started. Okay. Now, how does she know when the new menses starts? Now, if she can tell the difference between the two types of bleeding, there was at least 15 days of weak bleeding, at least 15 days, not less than. If the bleeding was continuous, I'm talking about if the bleeding never stopped. If the bleeding was continuous, and then so she saw strong blood, then she saw weak blood, then she went into day 16. She knows that it's not all menses, but the bleeding never stopped. Then, after that weak blood, she saw strong blood again. And that weak blood was at least 15 days. Then when the strong blood comes, that's her menses. That's the case of the one who can tell the difference. She's called Mumayyiza, the distinguishing woman. Okay. Now, if she can't tell the difference, so it all came out the same way. She's on day 16, it never stopped. And then after day 16, it still never stopped. It's all coming out the same way. Then, well, I'll tell you what, let me make this easy on myself so that I don't run through every single scenario. So, based on what I've said to you so far, do you have a question that helped me direct the answer exactly to you?
Yeah, so I'm definitely the person who can distinguish. And the 15 days is definitely lighter than what I'm used to. The sickness bleeding.
Okay, you're saying that the menses started and you saw stronger bleeding, then you saw weaker bleeding, you went into 16 days.
Yeah, so I had my norm bleeding that I know is my menses. And that went up to 15 days. But towards the end of that, so once the 16 days started, it was very light. That was my istihada.
So it started light on day, like you basically had 15 days of menses and then it changed.
No, my norm is about 7 days. After 7 days, it was very light, but up to 15 days. So from day 8 to 15, it was very light, and it continued light until now.
So now you know, based on that those first 7 days was menses. The weak stuff was the istihada. Now, so what's your question after that?
So now I'm on the 12th day of istihada. So if I see any heavier bleeding, I would count that as my period.
No. Let's back up a little now. So you said on your 12th day of istihada, make sure you and I are in agreement with the days that are happening here. Take your 12th day of istihada, you mean from the 8th day that you started bleeding?
Oh, okay. Well, no. I'm not counting from that. Like this new rule you're telling me, I'm not counting from that.
Istihada started, Yanni, once you get into day 16, then you look back and you see where did the blood change. Wherever the blood changed, that's where the istihada started. So from there, how many days you have?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that means I'm on the 20th day of istihada today.
Okay, so that means that you've menstruated for 7 days, went clear since then. Since then, you have experienced the minimum time of purity, which is 15 days. Unfortunately, that time of purity had sickness bleeding in it. So now, if strong blood comes back, that strong blood is your menses.
Okay.
If strong blood comes back, then that strong blood is your menses.
And then I would follow my habit, or until it's heavy bleeding. Up until it's heavy bleeding, it counts as my menses.
You only follow your habit if you can't tell the difference. So you have two things: your ability to distinguish between two types of blood, and you have the other is the inability. So the ability to distinguish between two types of blood has priority over your personal norm.
Okay, so I can distinguish it, so that's fine. Okay, that was what I was confused about. Oh, and also, for someone with sickness bleeding, for each prayer, you have to make istinja, and do you have to make wudu?
Yes. For each obligation. So when the person has sickness bleeding, incontinence of urine, for example, same case, then the person for every obligation has to make istinja according to the proper rules of a person with a perpetual impurity. Has to make istinja according to the rules of a person who has perpetual impurity and make wudu for every obligation, which means that you can pray Dhuhr, for example, which is obligatory. Then you can do all the sunnahs you want without making the new wudu, sunnah prayers, reciting Quran, and whatever, without making the new wudu. When you're ready to do a new obligation, then you do another tahara.
Okay, barakallahu feek. That makes it a lot clearer.
Ameen wa feekum.
Thank you so much, Sheikh.